Okay, so I'll quickly introduce Ma'am. Krishnapriya Ma'am is an architect and an academic based in Mysore. She graduated from the University School of Design Mysore and pursued her master's from CEPT University in majoring in history, theory, and criticism. She currently works as an assistant professor at Wadia Center for Architecture, Mysore, and her chief interests lie in the overlaps between architecture, literature, visual culture, and the city, which she explores through her academic writing, teaching, and her work there. She was the recipient of the CEPT essay competition she was the recipient of CEPT essay competition in the year 2018, and she conducts the architectural writing and journalism elective at WCFA, and it's a space where multiple perspectives towards thinking and writing about architecture are explored. It was during one of those sessions at WCFA that the idea of Courtyard, the WCFA newsletter, was born, and for which she now serves as critic at large. Ma'am has also worked for Cochin-based architecture magazine Design Detail until 2015, where she was part of the editorial and writing team. And we are honored to have you guide us through this webinar here today, ma'am.
Thanks for that introduction, Devika. Uh, but I would like to know just a little bit about this endeavor of yours before I begin my talk today. Like I got a very brief on it from Neha.
Yeah, ma'am. So this is an initiative that we took from the Literary Club, and the goal is to make students more familiar with the field or with the niche of architectural writing and journalism, because it's a very it's not familiar with people, of course, and it's something that most people have a lot of confusions and there are mixed opinions about it, and people who do want to branch out and experiment with their interests, they often don't find that kind of direction or that kind of like those dialogues don't happen in college majorly. So through this initiative we wanted to start those conversations around architectural writing and journalism as a proper niche and as something that students can pursue later on post their graduation or post graduation.
Great. So I'm glad that you guys are doing this. I mean, it's really rare for this kind of an initiative to come forth from students. So I'm also really happy that you gave me this opportunity to talk about the kind of work that WCFA with our students.
It's an
And
honor to have you, ma'am.
thanks. So more than talking about how I write, I think I'll just focus on what I think could be the different perspectives in which one could think about writing about architecture, or in general, just thinking about architecture. And I've had the good fortune to have had some fantastic student collaborators in the 3 years that I've been conducting this course at CFA. So whatever I'm presenting here is a combination of efforts from the students and myself and any other faculty who might have supported us through all of these endeavors. So I'm just going to present my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Yeah, what do you see?
To be able to write, one must be able to read.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Right, so well, I don't consider myself any kind of expert writer, but I am someone who greatly enjoys reading, and I believe that that is responsible for how much I enjoy writing eventually. And this is not a thought that is unique to me. It is a thought that is shared by generations of writers. And if you were to just go through the writing habits of famous authors or thinkers or philosophers or architects for that matter, you would see that anybody who enjoys writing is somebody who generally enjoys reading and engaging with somebody else's body of thought, which they have crystallized in the form of their writing. So there's a fantastic little book called The Architect's Guide to Writing by Bill Schmaltz. And while he has named it The Architect's Guide to Writing, a lot of the tips that are given in this book are applicable to writing in general. And I think that is the potential that often gets overlooked when we talk about architectural writing. There seems to be some kind of a pressure that we put on ourselves that architectural writing has to sound a certain way. But that's the kind of notion that I am trying to sort of dispel through the course that I conduct and as well as through my own writing, because I myself am quite allergic to heavy academic writing. So when I write about architecture, I probably get to architecture at the end of the piece, while the rest of it is just everything that leads up to thinking about architecture. So I really like what he says here when he writes that readers and writers have an unwritten pact between them, and to read what the writer has written in exchange for certain expectations. So writing is not a frivolous activity, and neither is reading. I think I one of my pet peeves is this kind of a question that people ask where they ask you, "What's your hobby?" and people say reading. I don't think reading is just a hobby. Reading is actually pretty serious work. Even when you read for pleasure, it is serious business, because the more we tell ourselves that when we read, we're not just killing time, but when we read, we're actually engaging in an invisible dialogue with somebody who has written their thoughts down, then probably we would realize that it's not just a hobby. So he has come up with something called a reader's bill of rights. Like, what could a reader rightfully expect from a writer? For starters, what they're reading should exactly express the writer's intent. The writer has made every effort to be as clear as possible. The document is no more difficult than it needs to be. The document is no longer than it needs to be. And the writer has proofread the document and corrected the mistakes. Now, the two clouds that are present on this particular slide around writer's intent and proofreading, I think, are probably the most easily overlooked aspects of writing when one sits down to write oneself. Um, because writer's intent, that operates at many levels, even at a very sort of a metaphysical level. But proofreading is at the other end of the spectrum where it's actually a very mundane task. But proofreading is the equivalent to if you were cooking for somebody and you were serving the food that you have prepared to them. Imagine if you didn't take the care to serve it well and you just decided to sort of splatter the food onto the plate and put it in front of somebody. It tastes good, I'm sure it tastes good, but proofreading is just a way of showing that you care, frankly, like getting rid of all the typos and painstakingly going through your draft multiple times before you actually present your work to somebody, irrespective of how small or how large a piece it is or who your reader is. Proofreading is just, well, proof that you care. As for the writer's intent, that is something that emerges from a very personal dialogue with oneself. It's basically a question of considering three aspects: purpose, audience, and use, where purpose is why does this piece of writing have to exist? Like, why does it matter that it exists? And if it matters that much, then every aspect that goes into it matters as much as the overall piece of writing itself. The amount of care that goes into selecting your words and crafting your sentences and sequencing your thoughts one after the other, all of that comes under the purpose of writing. The next important aspect to consider becomes who's your audience? To whom are you addressing your writing? And who else might read it? Do you have a primary audience in mind? Who else is likely to read? So, if you're thinking about readership, you're also thinking about ways in which you can communicate to that set of readers. And in many cases, we're not entirely sure who our readers are going to be, but it always helps to think of an imaginary reader, a group of readers who are going to derive some kind of benefit or pleasure or something useful out of your writing. So that in turn helps you decide what should your vocabulary be like, what should the tone of your writing be like the way you would write for an audience comprised entirely of architects would be very different from an audience that you expect to be more diverse. So I think a lot many times what happens with architectural writing is that it goes into the sphere of extremely long winding spatial descriptions, which might make sense or not to a group that is largely comprised of architects. Because ultimately, when you describe space, it is very subjective. Sometimes some descriptions are extremely poetic, sometimes they are extremely abstract. But if you want your writing to make an impact, not just on a group of architects, but to a wider reader group, if you consider potential clients or students of other disciplines also, for example, as part of your reader group, it is possible that you would take the care to use language that everybody can try and understand. And finally, the use of your writing itself, like how is this going to impact the readers? What you have written, how is it going to be of any use to them? Like, do they need a piece of writing to help make a decision for themselves? Does it provide information that they need for their own work? So, this is something that I learned when I was doing my thesis, especially my postgrad thesis. And this is something that even I sort of keep telling my thesis students that what you're doing here is, and this is something that my teacher told me, that what you're doing here is not something that is, just a necessary milestone to complete your course. What you're doing here is going to be referred to by generations of students who are going to walk, the same halls as you. Who knows who's going to refer to your work tomorrow? So you have the responsibility of ensuring that everything that you put down in words is authenticated at least by yourself. Like, does this satisfy me? Do you expect a response from your readers? In which case, the tone of your writing should imply that you do expect a response and it's not a blank wall just comprised of your opinions that you have created. So your writing needs to probably contain those openers, questions for somebody to even venture a response in the first, to begin with. So just to sort of supplement this little triangle, this very important triangle of purpose, audience, and use, there's this evergreen piece that I always refer to, and it's one of the pieces that I began teaching this course with. It's an essay called Why I Write by George Orwell, the author of Animal Farm and 1984. So he wrote this essay called Why I Write way back in 1946, which actually, if you think about it, is not so way back either, but extremely relevant and very freely written. Like there's this kind of a forthrightness to this entire piece. So I would greatly recommend this essay to anybody who's not read it. So he gives four reasons as to why he writes. The first one is sheer egoism, which I won't be focusing on too much for the purpose of this talk. But the next three, that is aesthetic enthusiasm, which is this need to convey the beauty or the horror or anything, the wholeness of your experience to somebody else, right? Like you feel that people need to know about this, and you derive genuine pleasure out of creating a narrative which allows people to probably, I mean, they haven't experienced it, you have, but the least you can do is try and come up with a narrative that can transport people to, at least try and imagine what this experience might have been like for the writer. try and imagine what it might have been like if they were experiencing it instead of the writer. So the desire to share an experience which one feels is valuable and ought not to be missed. The next impulse is the historical impulse, the desire to see things as they are, to find out true facts and store them up for the use of posterity. So, do you feel that you have a role to play in documenting the time that you are present in? And are you in any way able to relate what you are experiencing now to what somebody might have experienced many years before? Do you feel that documenting this could add some value to the generations that are to come? Is there a political purpose to your writing? Because anybody who says they're apolitical do not know what political means. Everything is political. So, like Orwell says, no book is genuinely free from political bias. Like, for example, he says it himself that to say that art should have nothing to do with politics is in itself a political opinion. So, he basically defines political purpose as the desire to push the world in a certain direction, to alter other people's idea of the kind of society that they should strive after. So, writing then becomes a space to express your own aspirations for society at large, and which in turn could be something for a reader to resonate with. So, I mean, I hope that my notes are legible. I've just decided to keep this like very raw and process oriented because a lot of these are notes from my classes with the students at CFA. So this is a kind of a guide, like like a, I wouldn't call it. It's not written in concrete, of course, but this is something that works for me. Like when you take a piece of writing and you want to engage with it as a reader, there are some questions that you could ask yourself with respect to the piece. Like you could set yourself a bunch of questions before you begin your reading so that you feel motivated enough to go through with the reading. And this is mostly for people who also struggle with reading. So sometimes when you give it the sense of an exercise, it helps to go through with the entire piece. So one of the questions, so here we were discussing a piece called Less for Less Yet by Michael Benedict, which was published in the Harvard Design Magazine in 1999. And this was a piece that sort of was bemoaning that whole state of architecture, especially post the modernism period. So one question, the first question to ask one, the writer or to yourself as a reader right at the beginning would be, what is the author saying? What is the author asking or stating? Next, does this author get straight to the point? Like, how far do you have to go into the reading to know what the author is talking about? This question is also something to help understand the structure of a piece of writing because sometimes the introduction can be so long-winded that you don't really feel like your patience doesn't last enough to get to the actual point. Next is you pick a sentence or phrase where the entire point of the piece or the article is expressed because there will be there is there will definitely be that one sentence which becomes a bridge to the rest of the piece, which is where the intent of the author gets clearly expressed, especially in shorter pieces like essays. It might not be the case with novels, which where a narrative is built progressively over a certain length of pages. But with short pieces, and especially if one is writing a short piece oneself, it is always a good thought to keep at the back of your mind like, where do I bring the issue to my reader? And from then onwards, I just start building up on talking about why this matters. Next part would be how does the author support his or her argument? So you break the article down into its key components. So everything that you see in pencil around this is basically me trying to answer these questions that I have asked myself. So, what do you think is the tone of the article? Is the next question. So, I think that this piece, Less for Less Yet, is a piece that, well, obviously it got published in the Harvard Design Magazine, but the tone of the writing is not just directed at architects, it is also directed at people who at any level consider themselves, proficient enough to think about architecture. So there is a sense of a challenge and empathy to the tone that he employs throughout the piece. And this is something that you can find online. I mean, if you subscribe to the Harvard Design Magazine, you can obviously read all the pieces, but you can read, I think, about 5 pieces a month if you haven't subscribed. And finally, does the argument or do the arguments and the supporting arguments build up to a satisfying finish? And does it tie up with what he set out to say in the first place? And this is something, this is again a narrative tool that is very useful when you're writing shorter pieces, especially essays, when you're able to take your readers through a journey and as you finish, you bring them back to the point where you began. So it's like coming full circle. So this kind of an exercise I've personally found helps a lot, and it also helps students who are not who are usually doubtful about their own attention spans when it comes to reading. So sometimes if you treat it like an exercise, it might sound mundane, but it is actually quite effective. So we did a lot of, I mean, we've done a bunch of exercises. This is something that I did with the first batch, especially this reading exercise. So there were a bunch of exercises that we did together, but the most significant one was the creation of a newsletter. So at this time, this course started with the first batch of CFA who have recently graduated. And I mean, the convocation is not over, but they are done with the course. So it's like a proud moment for us as an institution. But this, I mean, I think it's quite poetic that this newsletter was born with the first batch of our college. And we began this exercise with some manifesto reading because writing a manifesto, especially when you are starting a publication like a newsletter, which is meant to last as long as your institution lasts, at least, it is important to, I feel, write a manifesto where you set out your intent, your vision, and your opinions very clearly. And intent lies in that golden zone between opinion and vision. So the way I looked at it was an opinion becomes the this space where you decide what should you be talking about, like what are we going to bring to the table. With every issue, this changes. So what is that key theme that is driving this particular issue? What's your narrative focus? And with vision, it's something which is a lot more long term. It's basically a question of what do you think the purpose of a newsletter is, and why does it matter that a newsletter should exist, because institutions exist even without newsletters. So why do you think this matters, right? And finally, I say intent lies in the overlap between these two because it is a question of what narratives do you feel support the vision of your newsletter, and what narratives could you keep bringing which will lead to an evolution of this vision, because it cannot remain static. It ideally should be something that is evolving with every group of individuals that run the newsletter. So this finally is what you'll find on the website for Courtyard when our newsletter is called Courtyard. And the Courtyard for us at CFA is also a space, an actual physical space where a lot happens. We get together in the space to learn, we get together in the space to celebrate. Sometimes you just find small groups of people sitting around having lunch, or you find solitary conversations taking place in this space. You find cricket being played within the space. There's it's a space that allows a variety of expressions, and we felt that, metaphorically speaking, our newsletter also stands for all of these. Uh, Rather than saying all of these activities, I should say that our newsletter is also a space where multiple expressions can find a platform, diverse expressions can find a platform. So it becomes a void, a platform, a space, a container, a womb, whatever you wish to call it. It can receive all of our impressions, yet it is much more and beyond the sum total of these impressions. So, I mean, throughout this presentation that I've put together, there is bits that I have written and there is work that the students have done. So this is something that we felt represents what Courtyard means to us, and hence this is what you currently find as who we are when you look up Courtyard on the website. So I've just shared a spread here from our latest issue. We are 20 issues young at the moment, and our third editor in chief, fourth editor in chief, has taken over, and the process of keeping this newsletter going has been very, very dynamic. It has definitely not been smooth sailing, but it has been extremely intense and interesting. And it is even more interesting to see what each editorial team brings forth with every, with during their tenure. So it's usually the senior most students in the college who lead the editorial team, and the junior classes provide all kinds of support, editorial support. So one thing that we have done is that we have clearly defined our editorial roles in terms of an overall editorial chief, editor in chief, who is assisted by editors who are the ones who source the material that goes into the newsletter. We have a layout team and a layout editor who, uh, in a way, sort of, I consider layout to be probably the most pivotal aspect of putting together a newsletter, because this is the team that gets to tell the other teams how much space do we have, because when you are putting together a newsletter, space is everything. So it's depending on space that you filter what needs to go into this and what could probably wait another issue or what will not make it into any issue. We have a graphics team which basically curates the sort of the overall visual aspect of the newsletter. And now, um, I mean, my role here is I call myself the critic at large. At least that's the post I gave myself, because I just sort of oversee the. I mean, I don't even oversee it. I am there as some kind of a, I don't know, like moral support in the backing, in the background, and I probably do some help with some last minute edits, and we have discussions periodically when it with respect to what is going into the newsletter, and if there is any kind of a controversial piece, for example, how do you work with a piece like this and take it to an audience such that it doesn't get sidelined, at the same time it does not offend unnecessarily, right? So it would be great if all of you could just look us up on wcfacourtyard.in, which is something that I've bubbled out there. So the next part to this is that, yes, writing is definitely one way of, and it's probably the most direct way of thinking about architectural writing and architectural journalism. But sometimes we find that uh, the aversion to writing and reading is not just about an aversion, but it is also sometimes about genuine limitations in terms of accessibility. And I'm not just talking about accessibility to books, I'm also talking about accessibility in terms of language. Sometimes the language is just so heavy that one cannot process. So is writing the only way in which one could express thought, or could other mediums also aid in the thinking process? So with the next batch, what we tried was breaking away from the mold of just writing and thinking of it more as different mediums of expression and the roles that different senses play in how we sort of absorb information from the world, how we process it, and how we in turn return our interpretation to the world. So, if we're looking at once again a triad of listening, reading, and viewing, some of the key questions that we dealt with were: does the medium of transmission impact how content is received and to what extent? Because it's not just about saying that writing is probably not the only medium or the most effective medium, but it is also about accepting the potentials and challenges associated with other mediums, visual mediums or oral mediums. So, that being one main question. And the next question being, as a curator of knowledge and experience, how do you decide on the most suitable medium of transmission for a theme or content that you're dealing with? And what are your criteria for making this decision? So, one quick exercise that we did at the beginning of this semester was a group of students. We divided ourselves into, I mean, the students divided themselves into three groups. One group of students listened to a piece, a podcast without a transcript or without a video supporting it. The next group read a transcript of a conversation between two people without the video and without audio. And the next group watched a video without a supporting transcript. Uh, and yes, they listened to the embedded audio. So, some of the questions that, and in the end, we all sat together and just compared what the experiences of, you know, receiving information through these different mediums was like. So, the same question: do you think the content of this particular podcast would have been transmitted better via a transcript or an essay written in the first person or a video? And the same question was asked for the other two mediums as well. So when you read a transcript, do you wish that you had a video to support it or audio to support it? And when you're watching a video, do you wish that you had a text on the side to support it? What advantage do you think that medium A has got over the other two mediums? Similarly, what disadvantage do you think medium A has in comparison to the other two mediums? But most importantly, how much control over content does the medium allow you, the receiver? So the responses were varied and extremely interesting. There were some who felt that listening worked for them because a visual medium can often tend to be distracting, and you end up missing out on key aspects of dialogue if you just keep watching what's going on screen. Some felt that it was difficult to keep attention, sort of rooted when there is no visual to support. Others felt that having a supporting text sometimes works because when you're just listening, you miss out on, if especially if you're trying to make notes, you miss out on what somebody might have said. So in many ways, through many discussions, we sort of came to the conclusion that these three, rather than being looked at in isolation, sort of work in tandem with each other. The visual can support the image can support the written word in turn can offer a lot of support to the image as well, and there are many connections between these different mediums. So what we did after that was a theme. The students rather worked on a theme which I gave them. And this theme was called Masks and Skeletons. And it was supposed to be an exhibition of photo essays. And here the students also worked on the oral medium, where auditory medium. Uh, One group of students worked on a podcast. Another group of students conducted an interview and worked on producing a transcript of this interview. And all of this was put together and presented as part of the exhibition. But the sort of driving theme of this entire exhibition was the idea of language and how it allows one to express, but at the same time, there is so much that sort of, just slips between the gaps, and rather, this whole idea of reading between the lines. When you don't read between the lines, a lot of information gets lost. So, the whole point of this exercise was trying to understand the inherent limitations of language, and sometimes the gaps that are left by language can be filled by other mediums like images or the spoken word. What is it that one's language allows one to do? And additionally, if a medium were to be considered the vehicle for language, how much agency is language allowed by sound, word, or the image? So this is a final layout of how the exhibition was structured. We did this in our lecture rooms, which can be, I mean, it's basically one large lecture room which can be converted into two spaces, or vice versa. You can look at it as two spaces that can collapse into one. And this was, I mean, I feel that what the students did here was quite intense, and this graphic in itself was quite informative. So what they did was they created these little totems for their work, and this was a map that was handed out to everybody at the start of the exhibition. So one of the intents of this exercise was also to not focus on developing a narrative just through writing, but using writing itself as a way to actively think about one's process. So this is an installation by Vaishnavi from the 2016 batch where she wrote a poem, and her exhibition, I mean, her installation was comprised of domestic scenes. And while we were working on the photo essay, another aspect that the students were asked to look into was how do people look at the images that you are putting together? Like, viewpoint also matters. Is it going to be an image that people are going to be looking into or looking at? Does the size of the image matter? Does the surface where it is exhibited matter? So, do you try and create a neutral surface, or do you try and work with a surface that already exists, in which case that surface also becomes part of your narrative? So, a little station was created where you could listen to the podcast, and the transcript of the interview kept playing simultaneously alongside on the screen. Another thing that is rather interesting about the spatial sort of aspect of our college is that there is no monotonous textural scheme within any room. Within a single room, you can find multiple textures. So, in this case, for example, this was a narrative based on, around this whole idea of transience and change. And it was, once again, these students chose to work with the idea of how a corridor comes alive, or this whole cycle of a corridor coming alive and becoming mute once again through a college work day. And they were quite insistent that they wanted to work with the background of brick, which you, I mean, this definitely would have a different impact if it were if it were put up on a gray wall. So the I think one major learning for all of us through this exhibition was that sometimes, even as the author of a work, at the beginning of the process, one does not fully realize the potential of the work. And what you think of it in the beginning could be very different from what it finally comes together as at the end. And the other potential of exploring a medium like a photo essay is the fact that with so much that is left unsaid in terms of words, there is a lot of space for interpretation for the reader or the viewer. And another outcome of that semester was the fact that we now have a college podcast, which is, I think, 4 episodes old and 4 episodes young. And you can find this also on our website. So essentially, the idea is that different mediums have different sort of, reaches, and they reach different audiences. So if you feel that you're someone who cannot relate to the written word or a printed image, but as somebody who processes when you're listening, there is nothing wrong with that. So writing is not the only medium that exists where one can think about architecture. Writing is just one of the many mediums. And these four, where you write, where you speak, where you listen, where you create an image, that is also probably just the tip of the iceberg, because through combining these mediums, one can come up with multiple different ways of thinking about architecture and life in general. So, what we are working with right now is with this larger theme of translation. Uh, for anyone who, I mean, for those of you who haven't read it, the essay Translation from Drawing to Building by Robin Evans is definitely a must read, especially for architects and students of architecture, because it talks once again about this whole journey of translating your thought into a drawing and that drawing into a built form. And then comes the next layer of somebody who is trying to document your work and how there's a certain imagination of space that is created by a drawing, which may or may not be supported by the final build form. So the drawing in itself has some kind of integrity as a language, and the build form in itself does give you a different set of information. But both of them have their own value, which may or may not support each other. So, another thing that is great about this essay is that it makes allowance for the fact that there is often a space where things do get lost in translation. And rather than looking at it as something that is getting lost in translation, it could be looked at as different potentials of different mediums. So we have just started exploring this theme now with the current fourth year batch, the 2017 batch. So we are hoping to explore the idea of translation across languages, because one recurring thought that that has kept coming to me during my student days and even now is this whole idea of how do I even talk about architecture to somebody who doesn't speak English? Like, the kind of things that we learn as part of our syllabus, is it does it automatically privilege a section of people who have had education in English medium schools? Does it mean that somebody who does not understand these words does not understand architecture? The other layer to translation becomes this whole idea of translating something from image to text. Like, you visit the Pantheon and you want to talk about this experience to somebody else. So one thing that we often hear is visit the building. Just go see these places. Then it will make more sense to you. Don't just read the books. But what is it that the books can do in case you cannot visit the building? Because so many of us just experience these spaces vicariously through somebody else's descriptions, right? So how do you translate from image to text without, sort of while trying to sort of retain the core of that experience? Then the whole idea of translating from text or sound to image, the vice versa. Now that you have read something and imagine that you haven't seen the space, what kind of a picture are you constructing in your mind as you read it? And if that in turn had to be put down into a physical medium, there is again, another layer of transformation that takes place from what you see in your mind versus what you finally put down on paper. So those are the themes that we are looking at in this semester. And I just want to end with this little excerpt from a book that I'm reading right now. It's this book called A Feeling of History that was recommended to me by a friend and a colleague. And essentially, it's a text that is a transcript of multiple conversations that have taken place between Peter Zumthor and Murray Lending. And I picked out this particular excerpt because in this, what Zumthor does is he essentially talks about the influences of the works of other writers and musicians on his own work. So this entire book is structured. This all the conversations rather that they have had. And what is interesting about this book that was published quite recently is that it is a collection of these conversations that took place over a 3-year period between these two individuals, right? So you can imagine how much sort of space for retrospection and reflection there might have been in 3 years' time. It is something that happens with our own friends and family where you have a conversation today, and 2 years later, there is a whole different perspective on why you might have said what you said or felt what you felt. So, what is interesting about this particular book is that they are having a conversation about Zumthor's project, the mining museum that he designed in Norway. And he talks about and in the preface to this book, there is a portion where Murray Lending talks about a short story that was written by Johannes Hebel called The Unexpected Reunion. I don't wish to give a spoiler by talking about the story itself. It's an extremely short story, so everybody should definitely read it. But what Zumthor says in this particular piece, where he says that Hebel writes a poem which in turn was set to music and became a popular song. So he writes a poem about basil, but this song or poem that he writes about basil is something that he carries within him no matter which city that he goes to. And he is able to relive the experience of another city when he's moving through an alien city, his hometown, when he's moving through an alien city, because just through the power of somebody else's words, which were set to tune. So I know that at the beginning of this talk, I did say that to be able to write, one must be able to read. But to be able to write, one must not just be able to read, but one must be willing rather, to be able to read, to listen, to watch. In general, just be open to stimuli and be open to interpreting all this sensory information, because there's so much that we're being bombarded with on an everyday basis. And who knows, there are so many ideas that are just getting lost as we sleep and as we talk, every time that we choose not to document our own thoughts and to sort of spend that time in churning our own thoughts and putting it down in the form of some kind of expression. Because I think we never fully realize the potential of our own thoughts until we actually give it a shot at crystallization in some form. So either in the form of a crystallized expression or a fluid expression, but basically just daring to express. Because when we don't dare to express, well, of course, it's an opportunity lost for us, but more than an opportunity lost for us, it's an opportunity lost for many, many readers and listeners who could have found something to hang on to and relate to just through your one single expression. It's like imagining a world where nobody would have dared to write or to make a song or to create a movie or to take a photograph. And that would have been a terrible loss. So, to come back to Orwell, I think the desire to write essentially comes from a desire to share an experience which one feels is valuable and ought not to be missed, even by those who haven't experienced it in real time. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it was very, very creative and very, very interesting what kind of approaches that you've been taking towards the course at WCFA. And it's overall a very wonderful presentation, and I personally feel that it's extremely creative the way that you're looking at writing and how it's branching out into even photo essays and thinking and documenting in such variety of ways. So thank you so much. We can now open up for a Q&A probably. So guys, feel free to drop your questions in the chat box or unmute yourselves and ask the question.
Yeah, Vaibhavi, the book is called A Feeling of History by Murray Lending, Mari, Lending, and Peter Zumthor. I mean, yeah, any question works, or more than questions, you could just probably talk about your own thoughts. When you started to understand and reading, I'm sorry, can you read that out for me, Devika? I'm
Yes,
somehow
sir.
not able to access the chat.
So Kritika is asking if when you started to understand that reading between the lines was an integral part to understanding reading and writing, how did you get used to that?
When did I? Okay, that's a tough one to answer because, and it probably goes way back. Like, I, I think I have not spent time on any activity as much as the time that I've spent on reading, and it's like this muscle that you develop. And I think the whole key to it is that you don't just view a book as something that is inert and the words as something, as something that is static, because every book is basically someone who has bothered to document their own thoughts. So when I read, for me, it becomes a conversation with the book itself. So this is author called Austin Kleon. So we've got a book club at CFA, and well, I'm currently taking a break from book club. But Austin Kleon is one of these authors that is quite frequently discussed at book club. And I think one thing that I got from Austin Kleon, which is a habit that I recently developed, was you need to dare to sort of have a conversation with your book, even in the physical form. And that means actually daring to underline and write your own thoughts in the books that you're reading. So, this is something that was very difficult for me to do because I believe that books should be maintained in pristine conditions and whatnot. And that's not because I believed in it, it's something that you are told, right? Like, especially in a typical school culture, you're made to cover your books, and even if you're underlining, you're asked to underline with pencil, you cannot underline in pen. So I of late have gotten into this habit of underlining in my book, especially if it's my book. I don't do it in other people's books, but I probably take a copy of it and then underline in that and write down my own thoughts, or if there's something else that I have read which I can relate to that particular piece, if there's something that you don't agree with. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but it really makes a difference when you just furiously underline something and you write, hey, you know what, I don't agree with you. And I think that's when that whole process of, yes, I agree with you, Ganesh, the books are amazing. Yeah. So I think, yeah, that whole process of engaging with a book like you're having a conversation, like it's not a passive activity. I think that's where the reading between the lines begins. Like it's not biblical. You don't have to take their word for something that's given, engage with it. How should we go ahead with architectural journalism? Okay. And no, that depends on like what kind of a career path you are choosing for yourself. If you wish to just write about architecture and not do anything else, the most logical option would be to join a publication. But other ways could be, I mean, even if you are part of a practice, you could write about your own experiences with practice. There is nothing to prevent that from happening. In fact, some of the best writers on architecture are people who have had intense practices. For example, Louis Kahn or Peter Zumthor, people who have very sincerely, poetically, documented their own experiences with their own processes, right? So you could be someone who's practicing and writing, you could be someone who's just writing, you could be someone who is teaching and writing. The options are many. And now it's not just about writing, you could be producing your own podcast, you could be curating exhibitions. There is a lot of things that one can do if you're interested in that sort of work. But I would suggest that you be very, very selective about the kind of publication that you choose to work for. Ideally, a publication that allows critical thought to be published rather than just, very descriptive forms of writing, very hagiographic forms of writing, where all you find is praise of buildings, but and nothing else. A very unidimensional and positivist way of writing, which is frankly quite detrimental. It doesn't help anybody. Yeah, Kutika, I'm new in that gang, but yes, it really does help. Are there any exercises that one can go through? Can you read that whole thing out, Devika?
Yes, ma'am. Uh, so Ajinkya is asking if are there any exercises that one can go through to avoid bringing in one's bias to writing, to avoid one's bias to writing.
Uh, I think I would like some clarity on that question. I'm not entirely sure what you're asking. Are you asking, are there any ways to break a bias towards writing as an activity, or are there any ways to avoid bringing your own bias into a piece of writing?
The second one, like bringing my own bias into a piece of writing.
Yeah, well, so that depends on the audience that you're writing for, right? Like, if it's an opinion piece, for example, like let's say it's a verbal debate, in that case, you absolutely have every right to bring your bias into the piece of writing. But if I mean, I personally believe that one can try filtering bias out as much as possible, but traces of it would still remain. The fact that you're even choosing to write about something shows that you feel something about it, whether it is negative or positive. You do feel something, and that is why you're even writing about it in the first place, right? So, I mean, it depends. It once again depends on intent, it depends on your audience, and that whole triangle of purpose, audience, and use.
Okay, thank you for the.
So do we have any other questions? Okay. Ma'am, Vaibhavi is asking, I'm not really good with writing and documenting things, so it becomes really hard to convert and convey my thoughts. So how to write appropriately? Basically, how to start writing, how to start with writing.
So a useful exercise when you're stuck is to just mind map. So if you know what you're going to be, at least I'm sure that at the starting of the process, now this again depends on two things. Do you know what you're going to write about? So do you know what if it's something that is a topic that's given to you, you would obviously at least have that starting point. But uh, even if you're just writing without any external motivation and you're writing for yourself, you would at least know what it is that you want to write about. And you probably don't know how to express how what you're thinking about this. So one useful exercise is to mind map. And I think mind mapping it's basically like making bubble diagrams for writing, right? Like we do it for design. So the same way you do it for writing. So you basically just sort of throw out every thought that is in your mind and all the related thoughts. So you put down your basic bubbles and then you keep pulling out secondary bubbles from it and all the related thoughts. And once that is done, you can probably pick up, okay, now how much of this can I actually address? Like, how much of this can I convert into a controlled piece of writing? Because usually, I mean, if I had to go back to something that I wrote, forget 3 years back or a long time back, if something that I wrote yesterday, it can still be revisited, right? So it is about deciding which narrative out of the multiple narratives that you can pick, which one can you actually work on? So there's the subjective factor where something matters to you more than something else. Then there are some very objective, mundane, logistical aspects like how much research can I do on a particular topic? Like, will I find enough information on something? Will there be people who are willing to talk to me about this? Uh, if there is a deadline, if it's a deadline based piece, the deadline is also a very important factor to consider. So based on this deadline, how can I structure myself? Yeah, I mean, but mind mapping is a very useful thing to do at the start of an exercise.
Ma'am, should I read the next question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So Neha ma'am is asking, what is it like to work on the script for a podcast?
Uh, that would actually be a better question answered by any of my students if they are present here. I think uh, if anyone is here from CFA who has worked on the podcast and can answer that question, or else I'll just go ahead and give my response.
What I'm trying to say is that what I'm trying to ask is that it's different when you write, just write for someone to read, but when you have to write a script, it's different, and especially for something which is sort of spoken later. So I'm
Yeah.
just trying to understand if there is a challenge, a different kind of a challenge there.
Okay. So one thing that I think the students and I both learned during the whole podcast exercise was that the duration of the podcast really matters. So ideal listening time would be anywhere between 20 minutes to half an hour. And when it exceeds that, your final segment better be so interesting that it keeps people going and, hooked on to wanting to listen to it. The second aspect would be the fragmenting, like like the breakdown of the podcast itself. Like, what segment are you beginning with, and what's like. So it's pretty much like writing in the sense that at the start of the podcast, it always helps to let people know, okay, so what is the spread that we have prepared for you, in this particular session. So we have. So I'll just go back to sharing my screen. I'll show you how our folks have gone about it. Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So here, like the segments were laid out both in the form of a poster and also in terms of terms of an introduction that is given at the start of the podcast. So you have you have a group of students who are talking about the movies that they have been binging on or series that they have been binging on. Then there was a music segment where people were talking about so this was a podcast I think that came out during the lockdown. So so the thing is sort of tapping into the vibe of the time, I feel. So during the lockdown, it made a lot of sense to talk about this whole idea of binge watching and binge reading and binge eating and binge listening to things, because that is something that everybody could relate to at that point of time. So in that sense, a podcast becomes like this again, a very dynamic medium, because you can pick two ways of going about it, right? Either you pick something that is universally relatable and sort of evergreen, or you pick something that is very current and in the moment, and you try and bring in as many of these in the moment segments as possible to keep your audience sort of hooked and listening. It also helps to pick themes that can be spoken about in a very um everyday uncomplicated kind of a manner. But this again depends on the intent of the podcast, right? So this is a college run student run podcast for the students of our college, so the themes are again closer to home and things that are extremely relatable to a student audience. So once again, depending on your audience, you pick a theme, and the sort of mundane logistical aspect which has to be sort of considered is that listening spans are also short, so it's good to fragment it so that somebody can also probably listen to a 15-minute segment if that's all they have the time or the attention for, and they could always come back for another listen, rather than having one large unbroken segment where you could probably listen to the first 15 minutes and maybe you'll come back to it after another 5 days, and by which time you have forgotten what you have listened to. So having it split into smaller segments is a good idea.
We have another question from Anand Prakash. You
Yeah, hi,
mentioned
so
reading. You mentioned reading as good way to writing. Please mention ways of having students love reading. I see value in writing.
I think once again it's about just cultivating that attitude, right? Like how we do case studies before we begin design. It's once again like it's just this. I mean, there's so much. I think one thing that we could do is probably not insist on extreme, extremely, complex texts, because there's enough that has been written in the world that can, there's enough for different kinds of audiences. So probably a graphic novel works for somebody, maybe a novel works for somebody else. Maybe there are people who do enjoy reading nonfiction and not fiction. So I think if there is a theme that one would like for example, if you're working with a group of students and you want them to familiarize themselves with a theme, you could probably think of different ways of approaching that theme. Sometimes there are movie adaptations of books that people could watch. So sometimes it's good to watch the movie and then go back to reading. There are many ways in which one could do it. And it often helps if we pick excerpts out and hand it over rather than handing an entire chunk of reading over. So maybe one crucial paragraph, maybe it begins there and slowly try to wean them into the process of reading. And then, I mean, it's something that I just keep trying, and the degrees of success are different. Sometimes people read, sometimes they don't. Another way to do it would also be to compile a reader. So even if it is for a book club or for a class, if somebody is going to be leading the class or leading the book club for that particular semester, you could curate a series of set of readings and hand it over right in the beginning so that people could just flip through it at their own convenience and ease. But I don't think reading can be something that is forced. So there always has to be a backup plan that if you don't read, how else do you sort of get it? There is definitely loss if you don't read, but there are other ways also to access that information. But that's again coming from a very teacher trying to make it work in class perspective. At a very personal level, I think just having a great access to a great library is a good beginning. I didn't understand that question. Devika, could you please read it out?
Anjali's question, ma'am.
Yeah.
So Anjali is asking, can you please suggest some books to read as a beginner to improve our architectural dictionary? Uh, Maybe she's talking about the architectural lingo to get more familiar with it. Anjali, can you please elaborate by unmuting yourself?
Uh,
Hello, am I
yeah.
audible?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Anjali.
actually my question was we are about to complete our graduation, but still when I read some books or some articles, I feel myself I'm not known to many architectural terminologies or words. So how to improve in that way?
Okay. I don't know if it's a must to imbibe an architectural vocabulary, but if that is what you're interested in, well, very basic would be Form, Space, and Order by D.K. Ching. At least he uses the big words in ways that one can understand, and they're also supported with images, thereby indicating, and those images are drawings that he has made. So it helps to sort of try and understand those concepts. And Analyzing Architecture by Simon Unwin is also a good book to begin with.
Ma'am, we have one more question by Nidhi from
Yeah.
WCFA. Note making is definitely a skill that must be acquired in our course, and with time, the process becomes particular to an individual where the main focus is how one could diagram their thoughts. How important or how different is the note making process outside our course?
That's a question, Nidhi, that actually you yourself are equipped to answer, because how different was your note taking before you came to college?
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah, Nidhi.
Yeah. Well, before, like, say, in high school or college, it was mostly elaborate, where I wouldn't jot down the main points or things like that. Probably in our course, still I'm learning is how to sort of synchronize or get what's the essence of the whole, say, a lecture or a book or whatever I'm reading in, say, 2 or 3 lines, or say a diagram which could probably sum up the whole presentation for me. That's something different, at least what I've observed. So I
Yeah.
was, and I'm not a reader, so like I don't still have a habit of, like, reading books for a long time. So I was just wondering, how would it be different when you're reading say a novel or a poetry or anything like that?
Okay, so this differs from person to person, right? I can just talk about things that I do. So I used
Yeah.
to so it's something that I'm finding difficult to do now because maybe my time management skills have become poorer. I don't know. But once I used to make note of paragraphs or excerpts that I found really interesting in a separate notebook and probably add on my own understanding to it. But now that has been replaced by me myself underlining in the book and making my notes on the side with that.
Yeah.
So that is one way of doing it, I suppose. And I've also, I mean, strangely found using unruled paper very liberating, because throughout school we're using ruled books, and I like the liberty that unruled paper offers. Like you pretty much just make notes however you
Yeah.
want and draw connections however you want and fill the spaces however you want. But I think the most important part about note taking, which is probably different from how it was done in school versus how we are at least doing it in architecture college, I don't know about other courses, is that there is room for interpretation. Like you don't, once again, while making note of something that somebody else has written or someone else has said, the more
Yeah.
important part would be to write down what we understood from it or what we could relate to from it. So the bit that we bring to our own notes is probably the most important aspect of note taking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And also, another thought is how it varies. Say you're reading it on digital platform, how your note making process varies from unconventional method of reading. If you
Yeah.
could share something about that.
So on a digital platform, yes, there are definitely limitations. So,
Yeah.
well, if we are reading on basic devices like a laptop or a phone, uh, well, so you can always highlight the bits that you're reading, but it always helps, I guess. I mean, I'm sort of starting to enjoy the experience after I got a device that is also supported with a stylus. So now I can
Yeah.
use the digital medium like I would use a physical medium. But
Yes.
I think if uh, that is not an option, the second best option is to get a printout, or if that's getting a printout is also something that you don't wish to do, either to save paper or to, or mm, because you're not able to, uh, you could always once again just have a notebook open. Like no matter what, always have a notebook, whether you have a great device or you don't have a great device, always have a notebook in which you're constantly just making note of the things that really, really strike you.
Yes,
And these
ma'am.
could just be small bits.
Yeah.
Also, ma'am,
Thank you, ma'am.
taking forward Nidhi's question, Vaibhavi is asking as to how can we convert raw notes into single sentence or diagrams or into paragraphs and finished product.
Mm.
Actually, am I audible?
Yeah, Vaibhavi.
So, ma'am, while taking notes, like we just take a sentence or a like we used to draw things while taking notes. So, how to convert those notes into a paragraph or a like a finished wrote material?
Okay, so one exercise that I have tried with my students and which has actually had some really interesting outcomes is, now if you had to express a thought in 10 words, how would you do it? If you had to do it in a 100-word paragraph, how would you do it? And if you had to expand that same thing into 500 words, how would you do it? And all three of these lengths should convey the idea that you're trying to convey. So it's like uh, a very like let's say like your and if you're so, or you could also write one word that conveys that idea, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, so it's you it also helps to put a time limit on this exercise. So you give yourself maybe 2 minutes to come up with one word. So it's about spontaneity. So 2 minutes to do one word, 5 minutes to do, or 3 minutes to do one sentence of 10 words, 5 minutes to do a paragraph of 100 words, and half an hour to do a 500-word piece. And it might sound daunting, but actually, with as much as you keep practicing, it keeps getting easier. But
Hmm. Yes.
it really helps to
Hmm.
put a timer on yourself if you're struggling to write. And then the next part to this would again be to do multiple drafts. Don't fall in love with your first draft. One can always do better, but then also have that larger sort of deadline in your mind. And once you have your multiple drafts, so let's say you decide to stop at 3 drafts and go back and review your drafts, decide which of them is most promising and take that one forward. But yeah, it's a method that you develop your own method. This is something that works for me. It may not work for somebody else.
Hmm.
You could try this if
Yes, ma'am. Yes, thank you, ma'am.
yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Thanks, Neha.
Okay, then let's conclude it, ma'am, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, Thank you so much, ma'am, for a very, very interesting session. It was really refreshing to take a break from the larger picture of the field of writing and journalism and really get down to the details of it. So thank you very much for the wonderful session. Thank you everyone for being so responsive and for keeping such good questions coming up. Thank you all, and yeah, it was a
Yeah,
great
I think
session.
I thank Neha for the opportunity. Like, I'm really glad I could do this, and I wish you guys all the best in taking this forward because it's a brilliant initiative.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Neha, ma'am,
Yeah.
for helping
Thanks,
us
Devika.
connect. Ma'am.
Thank you, Devika.
Thank you,
Thank you,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Okay, Tanya. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Neha.
Thank you. See you all.
Thanks, KP.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.